You are first a human being, and then you are a human being who happens to be a judge by choice. Had you heard of ethnic cleansing prior to your appointment to ITCY?
Oh, sure.
But how did you separate this personal feeling of what you know as a human being from what your responsibilities would be as a jurist?
When you get into a criminal trial, you were sitting in a courtroom no bigger than this, say. There's one person who's in the dock, or maybe a couple of people who are in the dock. It's not a question of, did ethnic cleansing occur? Were those prison camps in existence? Did those prison camps do some very bad things? That's virtually, in the cases I was involved in, admit it before you go in. It comes down to a much narrower issue. Is that fellow in the dock, is he responsible for these crimes? And that's a different question than did some terrible things happen. Now, sometimes that makes you feel frustrated in the following sense. I'll make this brief. For instance, we had a prison camp case where the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Muslims did it too, but the Bosnian Serbs did it more than the Bosnian Muslims, established these prison camps, which have been compared to concentration camps where people suffered terrible deprivations, and there was everything from mutilations to arbitrary executions to rape and sexual crimes against women. We had some heartbreaking women witnesses. There were several of these camps up and down the region who'd been transferred from one camp to another, had undergone multiple rapes, and I remember one witness particularly who'd been raped 13, 14 times in several different camps. Now, her testimony was heartbreaking, and nobody in that courtroom doubted the credibility of the fact. What happened, of course, is that that poor woman did not remember all the details of all the 14 rapes. And so when it came time for her to have to describe or to attempt to support the prosecution's case as to whether she had been raped at a particular time in a particular place by that defendant, her story not fell apart, but she could not remember. She had the details mixed up as to which was that rape and which was other rapes. So you were in this dilemma. You know she suffered very badly, you know things have taken place, but you have that ultimate responsibility. Is there proof that that defendant was the one who did it? So these kinds of dilemmas, I think, after you've been a judge a while, I don't say they make it easier, but you're used to them.
You're a big supporter of the International Criminal Court.
I do think it's a very needed and a long-awaited development for international law to have one international court that is at least a flagship or a place to go when national courts can't perform the function.
Why do you think the United States opposes that?
Because of the definition of war crimes and the definition of crimes against humanity. They are not, you know, like did Mary hit Joe kind of thing. They are, did you bomb a certain kind of target so that the damage is disproportionate to civilians than was needed for the military necessity. And these are great big strategic slash legal politico decisions. And I think the fear is that American decision makers, whether they're civilian or military, would be hauled in by people who didn't like us, who were prosecuting or serving on those courts, who were mad at us for some other kind of political policy, and they would pull our leaders in, and even if they didn't ultimately convict them, they would have to justify their policies in court.
How do you maintain a healthy separation between judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys in a war crimes trial situation?
In the Nuremberg, as I brought up in my speech, things were a little cozier between the prosecutor and the judges. They did a lot of socializing. Not much of that happened in my time in The Hague. I think the whole development of ethics of the court staying distanced from both the prosecution and the defense is now much more a part of the ethical norms than it was back in those days. But basically, people kept their distances. I really didn't see any infringement of that, nor did I see it any more difficult to maintain than our own situation in the States.
Would you have any cautions to future judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys for the Al-Qaeda prosecutions that will eventually come about?
You know, make sure you really have a good case. Make sure you have your evidence down tight, and make sure you adhere to all of the same norms, basically, that you would adhere to if you were trying, or at least this is the way I tried to do it, if I were trying ordinary criminals back home in terms of their rights. Now, I admit there are certain areas, and we recognize them in our national law, certain kinds of evidence that's of high national security going on. You may have to have closed hearings in certain situations. You may have to have special procedures for letting that kind of evidence in. But we've been doing that in our national cases for 20 years. And I think it can be done and still preserve the elements of a free trial. I think the wrong thing or the wrong foot to get off on is, oh, these are so different, these are so terrible that we've got to just forget about all of the normal kinds of balances or rights that we have in criminal trials. You may have to, you know, fool at the edges a little bit, but I think you have to maintain the basic elements of a fair trial. And I think that's what Nuremberg taught us.